A little bit about how I got into it. I got into it in the dawning realization, another criticism that people, so you two have made a lot of good criticisms of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, but you also have been very supportive. Jonathan wrote a wonderful blurb for the book. So I know it's critique and not just criticism, and I appreciate that. And you know, the presentation of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis was very individualistic, and that's why the book is not. Awakening from the Meaning Crisis is deliberately dialogical. It is written in dialogue with Chris, and so responded that way. You know, all of the dialogical practices have emerged as a response, and they are our most popular practices, by the way, on the Awaken to Meaning platform, the dialogical practices, by far and away. So something important was there, so thank you for that. I mean, that's hit a nerve in the good sense of the word, in a deep way there. There's that. But there was another one that I've come to realize. You made about a bunch of other ones, scalability and stuff like that. But I keep responding to those as I take seriously what both of you have to say, and I aspire to be as a good listener who responds to good critique. Another one that's come out. And both of you, I mean, and you've often done it affectionately, but when I was talking about the religion that's not a religion, and then the critique became very clear to me, both from things Chris was saying to me, my own growing intuition, and then my beloved friend Bishop Maximus, when I was at the monastery in Etna, he took me aside and said, "John, stop talking about the religion that's not a religion. You're just alienating everybody, and even though you don't want to, you're setting yourself up as something." And this is all just wrong. And then he said, "I really like the philosophical Silk Road idea. Use that." And that's what I pivoted to. And I think the part of the critique was this, that although I think some of the ideas I was talking about is important, and we can maybe come back to that, the framework was really, and the orientation was wrong. It was very much an enlightenment, I mean the European Enlightenment framework of I'm going to engineer a solution in this purely, formal manner, design a religion. And then it occurred to me, given my growing experience in all of my practices, especially the dialogical practices, when dialogos happens and the conversation takes on a life of its own and people are feeling deeply called from within to being deeply called without, in a way that everybody gets beyond where they could get on their own. The central feature of that spirit, of that Geist, is it takes on a life of its own, right? It advents in a really important way, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then I realized, oh, I can't make this. That is just fundamentally the wrong attitude. And instead, what I have to understand is I have to understand that the sacred is something that comes and takes on a life of its own and shapes people and transform them in ways they could not have foreseen, but for which they are grateful. And that was a fundamental pivot. So it's another criticism of Awaken to Meaning that I've taken to heart and I've tried to respond to. And I've tried to respond to it both theoretically, a reconceptualization, and existentially. And so what I mean by Advent is you're getting already at one sense of it. I mean an orientation to the making space, Eckhart's images of making the manger so that the Son of God can be born again in you. Making space, but not just empty space. It's an affording space so that the sacred can come into the world and take shape as it wants to do. I'm sorry, I don't mean to use anthropomorphic language. I know neither one of you would care, but right. And so that is definitely what I'm emphasizing. It's a fundamental way of reorienting, reapprehending, reappreciating the sacred and reappropriating what our relationship to it should be, our religio to it should be. And so what I mean more by the Advent is I think the meaning crisis has got two aspects to it. Paul, I talked to you about this, the symptomology with Chris, all the negative signs that are breaking frame and breaking institutions, and we see that just continuing and unrolling. And Paul, you've been doing a lot of work about that and with the withdrawal of modernity. But there's a lot of frame making. We have all these spontaneous communities, and Rafe, Paul, you've got to meet Rafe now, and you know about his community. You know what a fundamentally good faith guy Rafe is and what he represents. He's an exemplar. But I meet lots of these people in lots of these communities, and that's happening all around the world, like Thomas Staudinger in Germany, for example. So I think that's one of the main cultural things, that frame breaking and the beginnings of frame making, which I speaks of an advent. It speaks like something like an insight, but on the level of the world, not on the level of an individual. And then what's happening, and this is part of what's going on in my book. When I came into the cognitive science of religion, I said, I'm not going to give you a definition of religion. I can't, because the very word we use and the concept we have is all within the Enlightenment framework. And the Enlightenment framework is built of all these disastrous dichotomies, right? The fact value distinction, is ought, theory data, right? Mind body, mind world, self other, religion science. That whole fable that religion and science have been in nothing but conflict has been destroyed by excellent, excellent historical work. The relationship is much more complicated and much more one of mutual affordance and mutual transformation. And all of them, the fact, like, if you want to, I can get into it, but, is relevance a fact or a value? Well, relevance points to that there aren't any facts without relevance, and there are no relevance that aren't correctable by the facts. All right. And the startling thing to do is just ask people, what do you mean by a fact? And they go, you all worry about value and subjective and how could it possibly be real? And you just take it that you know what a fact is. Well, Putnam destroys that. Quine destroys the analytics. And these are not like, people on the beach in LA, right? This is the guts of rigorous analytic philosophy. And so what I said to them is, I'm going to run through, right, and the demarcation problem in science, right, which is a central problem. There's no clean way of deciding where science leaves off and non-science begins. You just like all of this. And I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do like Wittgenstein does. I'm going to take apart, I'm going to deconstruct and dissolve a picture. And then how does reality and religio now disclose itself to you? And what might you be called to say about religion from that? That's what I'm doing. And that is the advent of the sacred. There's the breakdown of the monolithic mind, that the mind is monological. It talks to itself and it just uses logic. Monophasic, one state of consciousness is the only one that gives us access to reality. We don't have to undergo transformation to get truth. We just need a universal calculus, as Leibniz said, and we can just calculate everything, right? So that's collapsing, and we're recovering the other kinds of knowing, and more people are talking about this. We have the advent of 4E cog sci, which I don't have to go over again, I hope, about how that's really making all kinds of topics associated with religion, spirituality, and the sacred scientifically legitimate again. We have the fact that overlaps with a renaissance that's happening in biology. Biology is the science driving a scientific renaissance happening right now. It is the science that is feeding back ideas into the other sciences and fundamentally altering our sense of who and what we are. Now compare that to what's happening, the decline of physics. The Nobel Prize was not given to a physicist. It was given to a cognitive scientist. That tells you something. And you got all the people talking about there's been no significant theoretical advance in physics at quantum level for 50 years, and no significant advance in relativity for over a century. And so notice that contrast where the living things are now coming to be the paragon through which we understand reality, science, rather than the merely physical things. That's happening right now. And so I think all of those, and I see this when I'm talking to academics, this sense that all of this different stuff is starting to coalesce and give birth. And what I'm expecting to happen and what I hope to afford to happen with the philosophical Silk Road is to get all this these three things, this sort of cultural frame breaking, frame making, all this academic work, and all these emerging communities into a deeper dialogue with each other. Because I think that will afford the advent of the sacred. It'll afford a way, a place in which it can take on a life of its own. What do I mean further by the advent of the sacred? I mean the rebeautification, the re-glorification of what we take the sacred to be, and we move it fundamentally from something that we assert to something we appreciate. And I think that is part of what I mean by the advent of the sacred. By the sacred, I mean the triple transcendence that the atheist but Canadian philosopher, yay, Schellenberg talks about. I mean, and talking about this a bit also in the Cognitive Science of Ritual course eventually, Jonathan. The sacred is that which is most real, gives us ontonormativity, the really real. It is that which is most reorienting or orienting for us. It gives us our North Star, and it's that which is most transformative of us. It can bring about the comprehensive transformations that constitute things like rebirth, enlightenment, metanoia, moksha, etc. And so what I think is happening, final thing, is this. I think an ecology of traditions is taking shape, creating a lingua franca, lingua philosophica that is analogous to the ecology of practices that individuals and groups participate in. So there are many books, and believe me, I'm reading them all right now for the Philosophical Silk Road. But one, for example, written by a Christian, by Bracken, called The Divine Matrix, which is something like the travelogue for the Philosophical Silk Road. Saying he looks deeply into like the pagan Neoplatonism and then Aristotle and then Christian Neoplatonism, and then he looks into Taoism and Buddhism. He left out Vedanta, which I think is a bit of a mistake. But he said, and he's not doing some weak, oh, we should all love each other. He's saying that right there is a lingua philosophica running through all of this.
Mhm.
And right, rather than it challenging anybody being homed, it can actually rehome them more profoundly, but it also can help people to travel where they need to go. And um, and I think that points to what Paul talked about. I mean, we still get, there's a video I just saw the other day about, the death of God and the growth of secularization, but that's not what the research is showing. The research is showing is that this is becoming a much more spiritual, I'm going to use that useless term, time for us. And I think what that means is the people's hunger for coming into religio, a meaning in life enhancing connectedness to what is most real and transformative and orienting, that hunger is growing. And what's at issue is people they need, and again, this doesn't mean that they have to leave the religion they grew up in. Um, but many of them need a rebirth of it in some way. I'll use Bishop Maximus's term for what Christianity did to Neoplatonism. They need a transfiguration, a rebeautification, a reglorification, in order for them to return or to journey and find. And I think all of that also bespeaks to the advent of the sacred. Sorry, that was a bit of a thing, but I was trying to give a comprehensive and as concise of an answer as I possibly could. Finally, for me, my relationship to this is not intellectual or even philosophical. My relationship to this is existential, spiritual, religious. I feel called a profound responsibility to, well, undertake the pilgrimage on the Philosophical Silk Road, to do my best to be responsive and responsible to the advent of the sacred. So that is where I'm at existentially.